Please forgive me if I stutter, hesitate, or mispronounce anything, and for any noises in the background while reading this work. This is a continuation of our reading of last week's chapter, Chapter 2, Part 2. Trigger warnings, panic attacks, and character death. They carried on like that for months more. Every morning, Wilbur would pull himself out of bed and head down to the gardens, where Technoblade would always be waiting, even after the times he threatened to leave, and the times that it looked like he was truly going to. Technoblade would walk Wilbur through the stances and correct them by demonstrating how exactly it would be turned against him. The tutor was never fully pleased, but eventually they made their way through their weapons in the chest and had to request for more to practice with. Spears and knives and axes. They never spoke beyond the usual instructions, and Wilbur never complained again when, a few weeks in, he almost disarmed Technoblade during a sparring session with the rapier, before Technoblade inevitably knocked him over again. "I almost got you," Wilbur had grinned, even as he picked himself up from the floor. "Almost won't cut it on the battlefield, Princeling," Technoblade had said with a roll of his eyes, "and I was going easy on you." "Whatever helps you sleep at night," Technoblade snorted. "I don't sleep." Wilbur was still debating whether he'd been joking or not. Eventually, Tommy's jealousy outweighed his drowsiness, and he began to follow Wilbur to the training pavilion, yawning on the way, with his blanket wrapped around his shoulders and trailing in the dewy grass. He'd sit on the floor shouting unhelpful advice and laughing at his brother's failures. "Technoblade," the younger prince had said at one point, "will you train me alongside Wilbur?" Technoblade eyed Tommy and his blanket, looking so serious that Wilbur thought he might actually be sizing his little brother up. "Well, you do have a similar skill level." "Hey!" Wilbur tossed a stray pebble at Technoblade's head. It bounced harmlessly off his braided hair. "I want to be strong like you," Tommy said, uncharacteristically solemn as he stared at the older boys. "And like Dad." He raised his gangly arms up at them. "Look at these, Technoblade. They're pulsing with potential." Technoblade arched his eyebrows at him, an amused smile tugging at his lips. "Little Prince, you are years away yet from needing to learn anything. Your brother's training so you don't have to. Understood?" Tommy pouted, but nodded. Wilbur stared at him, feeling as if he'd just witnessed the taming of a wild beast. He glanced at Technoblade, who had walked over to the one corner of the pavilion to stretch. "How'd you get Tommy to not kick and scream like he does when he doesn't get what he wants from me?" Wilbur called out. "I don't kick and scream," Tommy huffed. "I let out a manly whine." "It's probably because he respects me and not you," Technoblade replied curtly. Wilbur whirled on his brother. "Is that true?" he demanded with a fox heart. Tommy shrugged. "I'd respect you more if you weren't reading all the time." "I'm not reading now," Wilbur said at the same time Technoblade called. "I know how to read, too, just to put it out there." Afterwards, they would eat breakfast together. Sometimes it would just be Wilbur, Technoblade, and Tommy going over the practice sessions. Technoblade with his dry corrections, and Tommy with his enthusiastic, albeit often inaccurate, input. But often Father would join them, and Wilbur would be lying if he said he didn't feel a little validated whenever Technoblade praised, or even as close as the man could get to praise, his improvements in front of his father. Mother had taken to waking late, and took her breakfast in her room. They'd visit her there, Wilbur and Tommy, but she'd often be too tired to speak at all. Tommy tried to introduce Technoblade to her once, but she was already asleep again by the time they arrived at her bedchambers. "Probably for the best," Technoblade had said. "I've been told I don't make great first impressions with mothers, mostly because I meet them after I've just slaughtered their children." "Please reserve the morbid jokes for after Tommy's gone to bed, Technoblade," Wilbur said. "What does slaughtered mean?" Tommy asked. "I tickled them," Technoblade said. "Oh." "To death." "Oh." Wilbur had hit Technoblade on the shoulder, but he was laughing too. 3 months in, Technoblade finally relented to letting Wilbur practice long-ranged weapons, which turned out not to be his forte after all. The sessions had to stop after Wilbur almost took Tommy's eyes out with an arrow. Tommy was inconsolable. "Please don't tell Father," Wilbur begged as he kneeled in front of his wailing brother, wiping Tommy's cheeks as fast as the tears came. "It was an accident, Tommy." Technoblade was cackling, leaning against one of the pavilion's sculpted pillars. "You should see your face," he managed to wheeze out between his gulps. "Oh my gods, it's so hilarious." Wilbur turned to glare at him. "You do know, if he tells Father, that it means you're in trouble too." Technoblade snorted. "I'm not scared of your father." There it is again, that arrogant dismissal, as if father were nothing to him. Wilbur clenched his jaw to keep that barbed remarks from spilling. Tommy was still wailing, his tiny face turning red from the effort. Okay, Techno said after a long moment. That's getting annoying now. Stop. Tommy didn't. Tommy, stop, Technoblade said more loudly. Tommy stopped, only to wipe his nose on his sleeve, hiccup, and then wail again. What's wrong with him? That usually works, Technoblade grumbled, stalking closer to them, with the caution of a hunter approaching a wild animal. Welcome to the world of Big Brotherhood, Wilbur replied bitterly, still wiping gently at Tommy's face. We hope you enjoy your stay, but most likely you will suffer. Technoblade came to kneel beside Wilbur. Tommy, Technoblade demanded, this is very irritating. What you are doing, please quiet down. Tommy responded by crying louder. Oh, for the love of... What will it take for you to shut up? I'll do anything at this point. The crying stopped immediately. Oh, gods. Wilbur put his face in his hands. You're not supposed to say that, Techno. You're never supposed to say that. What? What? Technoblade demanded, panic seeping into his voice for the first time since Wilbur met him. What did I do? What in the world did I do? Tommy sniffled. You said you'll do anything? Realization dawned on Techno's face. Well, not anything per se. Tommy's eyes began to water once more. Okay. Techno ran his hands across his face in frustration. Fine, one thing, and you'll shut up forever. I want to braid your hair, Tommy said at once. Technoblade blinked. What? What? Wilbur echoed. You once got me to let you ride me like a pony across the castle, and you asked him to let you braid his hair? Tommy nodded with all the solemnity of a judge announcing someone's death sentence. Wilbur and Technoblade exchanged glances, Technoblade one of bewilderment, and Wilbur one of utmost betrayal. That was how they found themselves wasting the morning away, sitting together on damp grass, Wilbur leaning back on his hands and raised his face to the sun, letting the light settle against his skin. He could hear Tommy scurrying around, gathering flowers as the spring breeze blew through the garden. For a moment all Wilbur could feel was a sudden, all-consuming affection, not for anything in particular, but everything, for the brilliant spinning wheel in the sky, turning everything into burnished gold, for the soft dirt beneath his hands, for the air in his lungs and the pollen on his tongue, for the distant sound of his brother's footsteps, for the boy sitting beside him that, against all odds, Wilbur found he might actually like beyond mere tolerance, for the levity that had started to chase away the more exhausting thoughts. He cracked one eye open and found Technoblade staring at him again, with that all-too-serious look. What? Wilbur asked. Can't a man be glad he's not getting tossed around for one morning? Technoblade scoffed. Don't discredit my teaching skills like that. You've been getting tossed around less and less these days. Was that meant to be a compliment? None of my compliments will ever be meant. They will be passive-aggressive at best, openly hostile at worst. Of course, we have to pry positive affirmation from your cold, dead hands. Is that it? Only way you'll earn it, Technoblade confirmed. They went silent as another breeze blew past them, blowing Technoblade's unbound hair across his face. Then, before Wilbur could think twice about it, he said, What did you mean before, when you told Father our tutoring sessions were a distraction? A distraction from what? Technoblade's expression darkened for a fraction of a second before he schooled it into a careful neutrality. He shrugged nonchalantly. Well, a growing boy like you're meant to have hobbies beyond whatever you were doing before. I read, Wilbur said, and played music. That was a sufficient distraction, I think. Not according to Philza. Why do you talk like that, by the way? Wilbur shifted to look Technoblade squarely in the eyes. You call the king Philza, which I can excuse because you're, well, you. But Father also calls you an old friend, and I've asked Mother, because Father tells Mother everything, but she's never heard of you before. And you know all these things about weapons and warfare. Far too much. From a kingdom that has enjoyed peace for decades, Princeling, Technoblade said with a world's worth of exhaustion in his voice. Beyond those walls, it's different. Knowing war young is not entirely uncommon. Kids just grow faster out there. They have to. Wilbur took fistfuls of grass and threw it at Technoblade's face. Technoblade, unamused, simply blew the grass from his face. Very mature, Your Highness, Technoblade said dryly. You were being all sad again. Pulling his knees up to his chin, he looked up to see Tommy came toddling towards them, his arms a burst of color, yellow alströmerias, white daisies, purple malves, and freesias, the color of Technoblade's hair. Oh gods, Technoblade groaned as Tommy dumped his collection before them proudly. Tommy grinned as he kneeled behind Technoblade. Dad used to braid Mama's hair all the time, before she got tired. He taught me how. Technoblade turned towards Wilbur. Should I be worried? Very, Wilbur said sagely. At least he doesn't have scissors this time, he added, recalling a particularly incensed butler who'd foolishly offered himself to be Tommy's training dummy last year and ended up with less hair than he bargained for. Tommy turned Technoblade's head away from Wilbur. Hold still, he ordered, beginning to take handfuls of Techno's hair, tugging them into place. Ow, Technoblade said after a particularly harsh pull. Sorry, Tommy said cheerfully and began to braid in earnest. Wilbur sat back and watched them in silence, his furious tutor and his even more furious younger brother. The sunlight seemed to catch in the tangles of Tommy's hair, making it shine like a golden halo. Wilbur had never seen anyone as focused as Tommy was in that moment, working through Technoblade's hair, pausing only to debate on what flower should go where, and Technoblade, for his part, did not move at all, or let out so much of a word of complaint, even when Tommy took time to educate them all on what exactly each flowers meant. I could write a song about this, Wilbur mused, and then marveled at the thought. It was as if a block he'd been carrying for years lifted, and his art was now inches away from his hands. If only he'd brought his guitar with him today. Tomorrow, he promised himself. I'll write our song tomorrow. There, Tommy said at last, tying the end of the braid off with a red ribbon Technoblade often used himself. Wilbur blinked in surprise. Tommy, that's actually good. Really good. Technoblade reached back and ran his hands delicately over the elegant braid and the flowers woven into it. He hummed appreciatively, then caught himself before he could fully smile, because he was still Technoblade after all. Decent, was his only comment. I'm not done yet, Tommy said, and he produced one more flower, a single yellow rose. This one's my favorite, he added as he gently tucked the flower behind Techno's ear, the one that had the emerald earring that Wilbur had found so familiar, because it means friendship. Techno stiffened, his mouth opened and closed, like he was trying to breathe but forgot how, before he finally said, Are we friends then? Tommy stood and brushed grass from his pants. Well, obviously. Obviously? Oh, hey! The sudden excitement in Tommy's tone caught both Technoblade and Wilbur's attention. He began waving to someone in the distance. He smiled as bright as life itself. It's Dad and Mama! Mother? Wilbur was on his feet at once, his heart hammering in his chest like a moth set aflame. Sure enough, there was Mother, out in the sun once more, for the first time in over a year. Wilbur took in a shaky inhale, not daring to breathe again, as if the image before him would dissipate like smoke. Mother, smiling at them as she walked arm in arm with Father through the garden. Tommy ran as fast as his tiny legs could carry him and launched himself into their mother's waiting arms. Wilbur couldn't ignore the brief flash of pain that flickered over his mother's features as she gathered Tommy into a hug, but neither could he help his relief at seeing her walk at all. Well, Techno said from behind him. Go ahead, then. Wilbur turned to his tutor and, before Technoblade could protest, took him by the wrist and dragged him over to where Mother and Father were waiting. Father's smile was gentle and welcoming, and Wilbur could almost forgive the sadness that remained in his eyes, like a ghost hovering at the edges of celebration. You must be Technoblade, Mother said happily, carrying Tommy in her arms as she addressed the tutor. I do apologize that it's taken us this long to be acquainted, though Phil has been telling me all about all you have done for our Wilby. Wilbur expected Technoblade's usual icy jabs, and was quite surprised when he bowed his head in what could pass as deference to an untrained eye. It's a pleasure to meet you, Your Majesty. Your sons have told me much about you. Mother gave Technoblade a conspiratorial grin as she asked, And I trust all they've said is in my favor, yes? Nothing about how sharp my tongue can be when I'm cranky? Oh, I assure you, they've painted you as nothing less than perfect, Technoblade glanced at Philza. Although Philza might have said a thing or two about your rigid standards for tea. Father chuckled. He pressed closer to Mother and Tommy, keeping an arm around Mother's waist, as if to steady her, as if to hold her together just a little bit longer. I told you that in confidence, Techno. Technoblade, Mother repeated. That's a rather odd name. I said the same thing, Tommy added brightly, always eager to be part of the adults' conversation. Technoblade only shrugged, once again demonstrating a level of chivalry that Wilbur would never have expected of the same man that regularly combated the king's orders. I would feel too much like a traitor if I abandoned it now. After all these years with it, it is my one constant companion, more loyal than most. Loyalty is a rather precious gift, Mother sighed softly. She transferred Tommy to one arm and reached out with the other, until she was cupping Technoblade's cheek. I do hope, my boy, she continued, her voice as tranquil as a still lake, that you will find the people you can trust more than your own name. You deserve that, and more, for all you have done for my family. Technoblade blinked slowly at her, for once struck speechless. Tommy giggled. Techno is blushing. I am not, Techno spat hotly. Yes, you are, Tommy cooed, leaning back into Mother's arms, safe in the belief that she would never drop him. You are so... Tommy, don't torture the poor child, Mother said, even as she giggled herself. Will, Father reached out and ruffled Wilbur's hair playfully. You look 100 miles away. Wilbur exhaled slowly. I'm just remembering. Remembering what? This. Mother's soft smile. Tommy's cheery laugh. Technoblade's half-hearted protest. Father's hand on his head. Everything. Nothing, Wilbur said. Forget I said anything. He smiled at his father, for once without reservation. He had never felt so light. He was almost a son again. Would you like to watch Techno and I spar? Father's expression softened. Of course, I would be delighted to. It was the last good day. The knock came at midnight. It dragged Wilbur from the comfort of his dreamless sleep. Wilbur! Technoblade's voice, urgent, almost angry. Wilbur, open the door! Wilbur threw off his covers and bolted for the door. Technoblade stood outside the bedchambers, his red eyes blazing in the dark. He said the 3 words that would come to haunt Wilbur until the day he died. It's your mother. They ran through the castle, Wilbur for the first time outpacing his tutor. They arrived at the long hallway that led to his parents' bedchambers, already choked with servants. Move, Technoblade demanded, his voice booming over the din. Move or I will make you! The servants rushed to the sides, clearing a path for Wilbur and Technoblade. Wilbur couldn't register any of their faces or their voices. All there was silence until the worst sound Wilbur had ever heard, an anguished cry that turned Wilbur's blood cold. Tommy. Tommy's here. He burst into the room and found his brother curled in a ball by the foot of the bed where his mother laid, sleeping. No, not sleeping. Not sleeping, not sleeping, not sleeping. Wilbur could not breathe. Tommy was still crying for their mother, for their father. Father! Wilbur's eyes scanned the room, but there was no trace of the king, no trace of the man who had just lost his wife. Tommy! Technoblade pushed past Wilbur and into the room. Wilbur could see him, could see it all, but felt like watching someone else's life happen from the leagues under the sea. Everything happened too slowly, too distantly. Technoblade kneeling by his brother, prying him off of the cold floor. Tommy wrapping his arms around Technoblade's neck, burying his head in his shoulder and screaming. So loud, too loud. Technoblade turning towards Wilbur, handing him something, pressing it into Wilbur's cold fingers. Wilbur looked down at his hands. It was a letter, crumpled, tear-stained. By his own tears, he realized belatedly. Techno, it said, tell the boys I'm sorry, and tell Wilbur he will be a better king than I ever was. The world fell out from under Wilbur's feet, leaving him suspended in the air, free-falling, with no true end. No, he thought, or maybe said, or maybe screamed. No, 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 this isn't how it's supposed to go. Oh, said the voices, but this already happened before. Wilbur blinked and blinked again. Father's gone, he said, not taking his eyes off the letter. He left. Wilbur, Technoblade's voice, rising above Tommy's agonizing sobbing. Was there worry in the other boy's voice? I found the letter slipped under my door, and by the time I came here, it was too late. Your mother, she was also gone? The letter began to shake violently, or not the letter, Wilbur's hands. But she was just here, this morning. She watched us spar. She was smiling. She was alive. Technoblade, Techno. This was inevitable. Wilbur clamped his hands over his ears. Shut up. It was meant to be. Go away. Wilbur fell to his knees, pressing his hands tighter and tighter to block out the sound. I thought I'd gotten rid of you. You said you were going to leave me alone. A sudden pace laced up Wilbur's arm, and he opened his eyes to find Technoblade kneeling in front of him, his hand in iron grip around Wilbur's wrist. Tommy was gone. When did that happen? And the silence he left behind was almost as bad as the screaming. Come back to me, Wilbur, Technoblade ordered. Who do you hear? You, Wilbur said, haltingly. He was not for this act, not for this stage. And the voices. Technoblade nodded, easing his grip on Wilbur's wrist. I can help you. No one can. Wilbur squeezed his eyes shut, but all he could see was his mother's still form, father's letter. Wilbur, look at me. Wilbur shook his head. I can't. Then listen to me. I can help you, Technoblade repeated firmly, because I have voices too. Wilbur's lungs began to ache with the quickness of his breath. You do? He He sounded like a child seeking comfort from a distant figure, but there was too much pain to make room for the shame. I do, Technoblade said, so breathe with me until they go away, and we can figure out the next step together. That was all they did. They breathed in and out, and in again. Technoblade's hand on his wrist and the sickeningly sweet smell of rotting flowers keeping him rooted to the ground, to the universe. In and out, and in again. And in between one breath and the next, Wilbur finally remembered where he'd heard Technoblade's name before. Father, Wilbur swallowed down a sob. He told me a story once. When I was young, the first time the voices ever talked to me. He told me the story about an immortal god who was doomed to hear voices in his head forever. A blood god, Technoblade. You're a god? Don't worry about that now. His voice was distant but kind. It doesn't matter. But I don't remember how the story ended. Exhausted was a heavy blanket, weighing him down until he was leaning on Technoblade's shoulder. His throat felt raw, like he'd eaten broken glass. The story has no end, the voices said, but they sounded distant too. Tell me how the story ends, Wilbur begged, as he felt the last of his consciousness slowly fracture into nothingness. Tell me you'll still be here when I close the book. Wilbur, Technoblade mumbled something too low to hear, and then he said, Okay, I'll be here. Wilbur wanted to say more, or perhaps he didn't. Outside, somewhere far away, bells began to toll, chiming his mother's death ballad, heralding his ascension. Tell the boys I'm sorry, his father's voice, this time as quiet as the rest. In between one breath and the next, Wilbur was king. In between one breath and the next, he was asleep.